Thank you very much. So we all talk about modern applications and building modern applications. And when we talk about modern applications, we talk about applications that are built by teams that are trying to be responsive to customer needs. We talk about applications that scale dynamically. We talk about applications that maintain a high level of availability. And in order to do that, you have to take into account technologies, processes, systems that help you achieve that, whether that's dynamic infrastructure, flexible architectures, DevOps culture in your organization, instrumentation, and monitoring. Now, I talk about all of these at various points in time, but I want to focus today on flexible architecture. And specifically, I want to talk about service-based architectures. We've talked a lot about service-based architectures. We all know what it is. Services that, as a whole, interconnect with each other and form a larger application. But when an application, or when a service deep in the bowels of your application fails, the problem can propagate into other services and become a major source of problem on the application as a whole. But sometimes services don't really care if a dependency fails, or they can do things to prevent themselves from failing when their dependencies fail. And sometimes it's hard to figure out whether or not a particular service failure is critical for you or not. Inter-service failures are the most common cause for availability issues in modern applications today. But resolving those issues and being able to add resiliency as necessary between those service connections is costly. And how do you decide where you want to put that resiliency? You can put the resiliency everywhere. Of course, that's expensive, and your application becomes substantially more complicated when you do that. Or you can try and hunt down and find the places where you think this is a critical dependency and we need to add resiliency here, but this one's less critical, we won't worry about that. Bottom line is, do you waste time and money, or do you make risky decisions? Well, what I want to talk about today is service tiers. Service tiers is a process that can help you make that decision, among other decisions as far as the availability and resiliency of your services. What are service tiers? Service tiers are nothing more than a label, that you apply to every service in your application. I typically use tier 1 through tier 4, and the higher the tier number, tier 1 being the highest, the more critical your service is. And the lower the tier, the less critical it is. That's all it is. It's a label for your services. We'll talk about why that's important in a minute, but first let's go through and talk about definitions we use for why we would apply each of these 4 labels to different types of services. Starting with the most critical, tier 1 services, those are services where the definition I use is tier 1 service is a service where failure results in a significant impact to customers or to your business. If this service goes down, it has a significant impact to your application, to your customers, to the business. A bunch of examples of tier 1 services. The one I like to talk about is the login service. If you have an application that requires customers to log in, if the login service is down, the whole application is down. That's the definition of a tier 1 service. Of course, things like credit card processing, order processing, those things can fit into that category as well. Tier 2 services, though, are services that don't bring down the entire application, but results in a degraded customer experience if the service is not available. A great example of a tier 2 service is a search service. Imagine if you own an e-commerce store where you can browse for products, find a product, look at it, buy it, have it shipped to you, all that whole process going on. You can do all of that even if search isn't available on the site, but search is a useful capability in the site in order to allow customers to find products better. You can survive without search, but it's a degraded customer experience. A tier 3 service is one that the service failure results in a minimal or a difficult to notice impact to your customers or to your business. Best example there, something like a recommendation service. Think of that e-commerce store again. You're on a detail page looking at a product, trying to decide if that's the product you want to buy. Right at the very bottom of the page, or maybe down in the middle of the page somewhere, there's a list of alternate products you might be interested in. A service produces that list and makes it available for you to use. Well, if that service is down, then the list doesn't appear, well, you can still use the store, you can still search for product, you can still buy product and have the product shipped to you. You may not even notice that the recommendations are missing, but it's still missing functionality, and functionality that's useful to customers. So it's functionality that's important, but not mission critical to the application. The customers may not even notice or only minimally notice if it's not available. And finally, a tier 4 service is a service where failure will result in no impact or only a minor impact to customers or your business. Best example here is think of like a sales report generation service, right? If your management needs a weekly report of how your sales of their product are going on, and if the service that generates that report is down for a couple of hours, it doesn't create a lot of business impact. And it has no impact on your customers at all. That doesn't mean the service isn't important, it's just not mission critical. So service tiers are a label that describe the impact the service has on your application as a whole. Tier 1 is significant impact, Tier 2 is degraded impact, Tier 3 is a limited impact, and Tier 4 is no impact. Well, this is all great and wonderful, but let's go through an example application and apply these service tiers to it, and then we can use that example to talk about how these service tiers are helpful. So let's build an e-commerce store. What I'm going to build here is a architecture diagram, a service architecture diagram that describes hypothetical services that can be interconnected that builds an e-commerce store. It's very high level, very simplistic view, but it kind of gets the idea across, and it's great for this purpose of this demo. Well, if you think the first thing you need is you've got customers. Your customers interact with services in order to view your store. They might view product on the website. They might put things in a cart and do a checkout and create an order. And they might view the status of that order. Relatively simple operations. You also have a database of product, in this case, t-shirts. That database has, it's a catalog of information about those t-shirts. And then there's a series of services that interact with the database and provide information to the front-end website. Things that view catalog entries, search service, price calculator for shipping and sales tax, that sort of thing. All of those are services that interact with the database and present information on the front end. You also have a merchandiser's interface to the store. These are the people who are deciding what product go into the store and are deciding which t-shirts are available and what the description of those t-shirts are. They're the ones that edit the database, edit the catalog, add new entries, delete entries, update those entries. They have their own interface and services that interact with the catalog. Customers, after they find products, they want to do a checkout. You need some sort of order management service, and the viewing order service talks to that. And you also need back-end processing, right? You need order management, order fulfillment, order processing. You end up with agents in your fulfillment center that use that interface in order to process the back end and ultimately ship orders to customers. And then, of course, I mentioned the weekly order report. Management has to have their interface as well. So this is a high-level architecture diagram of a store. But let's go through here and apply service tiers to each of these services and see what it might look like if we did that. First of all, we notice, customers, they have an interface. They're going to be viewing catalog entries using the catalog database. If they can't view the catalog, if they can't look at the store and look at the product in the store, you don't have much of a store. And so those services that facilitate customers being able to do that are tier 1 services. They're mission critical. Without those services, the application doesn't do what you need it to do. So let's label those services involved in that with a tier 1. Now let's talk about search. I mentioned search as an example before, but search is something that's highly useful to customers, but not mission critical. Degraded experience if it doesn't work, but not devastating. So that's a tier 2. We'll put a 2 by that service. Now we talk about the merchandisers, right? They have the mechanism that edits the catalog and updates the catalog and does all that sort of work. Well, this could be arguable whether it's tier 2 or tier 3, but in reality, if your merchandiser's interface to the application isn't working for an hour or two, you can't update the catalog, they can't do their job, but customers can still buy product. You can still ship the product, you can still process orders, you can still collect money from customers. Everything that matters to your business can still happen. You just can't do updates. That's about the definition of what a tier 3 service would be. So let's label those tier 3. Now customers, we talked about checking out, they actually want to, after they browse, they want to buy a product. Buying's important, right? If you can't complete an order, if you can't process an order from a customer, your application is DOA. It's a critical element of your application. So those are tier 1 services. And so we'll label those services that are involved in that process with a 1. But view order, before we do that, let's talk about the fulfillment center agents. They're the ones that are doing the back-end work that figures out what the orders are, grabs the product, boxes them up, ships them out. Yes, that's important, but if their services that allow them interface into the application isn't running for an hour or two, yeah, they have a longer day and their processes are delayed, but customers don't even notice that, right? Or mostly don't notice that. And it doesn't tend to have a lot of impact on your business. I mean, it's obviously the longer the delay, the more money it costs, but it's not a huge impact to your business. Again, arguably, this could be either tier 2 or tier 3, but I'm going to use tier 3 for this example. And so those services are tier 3 services. Now let's look at view order. Customers want to view orders. They want to see the status of their order. I argue this is a tier 2 service because it's a customer capability that they will notice if it's not there. It's something they care about and they consider an important part of the store, but yet they can still do almost everything they want to do without that capability. It's a degraded experience. That's the definition of a tier 2. So let's add a 2 by that. And now we're down to the management interface, a weekly order report. If a weekly order report doesn't go out for an hour or two, nobody cares except management. They don't really even care that much if it's a one-time event. These are obviously useful for internal use, no impact on customers. This is a tier 4 service. So we'll label that with a 4. So here we are, our whole store, all of the services labeled with tiers. And this is all great, this is wonderful, we've labeled with tiers, but what does this mean? And how do we make use of that information? Well, there's 3 things you can use service tiers for. You can use them for helping determine the responsiveness you require for a particular service. You can use it for managing dependencies, and you can use it for helping to set expectations about a service. Let's talk about responsiveness first. So when an issue with a service occurs, the responsiveness that you have in trying to resolve that issue differs depending on the needs of the service. And there's 2 things that your responsiveness tends to depend on. First is, of course, the severity of the issue, how important the issue is, how big of a deal it is. But the second one is the tier of service of the service. This can best be shown with a diagram if we describe problem severity on the left-hand vertical axis from low to high, and service tier of all of your services from 1 to 4, critical to non-critical on the bottom. Every problem that you run into fits somewhere on this matrix. And what tends to happen is problems that are critical that you want to work on right away will appear in the top left-hand corner. There'll be problems that occur on services that are critical, tier 1 services, and your most severe problems. On the other end of the spectrum, The non-critical issues, the most uncritical, the least critical issues, will be your less critical services and the lower severity problems on the lower right. There's a continuum between here of severity that you can use for prioritizing problem resolution issues. If issue 1 here is a super severe issue, but in a non-critical service, how does that compare to this issue here, which is a less severe issue, but occurs on a much more serious, much more critical service in your application? Well, you can essentially use this mechanism to determine which one's more critical, and of course the less severe issue but on a higher critical service is probably more important for you to work on first. You can use service tiers to help you determine the appropriate responsiveness of all of the issues that occur in your system. Dependency management. If you compare the service tier of the service with the dependency of that service, you can determine the criticalness of that dependency. For instance, if the service is a higher tier than its dependency is, that is by definition a critical dependency, because the service needs to handle the dependency failures gracefully. Think of it this way. A tier 1 service has a high level of expectation that issues be resolved quickly. The dependency is a tier 3 service. It's a lot lower expectation that issues get resolved quickly. So the service cannot depend on the dependency having its problems fixed in a manner that's timely enough for the service to meet its SLAs. So a dependency failure should not cause the service to fail. And this is a place where you want to invest energy, invest into hardening that interface in order to, as much as possible, prevent the service from failing with problems with the dependency occur. The opposite though, if the service is a lower dependency or lower tier, lower criticalness than the dependency, this is a non-critical dependency. And for the most part, you can ignore failures of the dependent service. Think of it this way. Your service is not that critical. It's a tier 3 in this case. And you have expectations set on speed of resolution of problems for a service of that level. The dependency that's causing the problems has a higher level of expectation. And you can count on effort being placed at a higher level for that service than what you really need to resolve your issue. So it's okay for you to fail or not work appropriately in the case of the dependency failure, because you know that that dependency is going to be fixed in time and an appropriate SLA that'll match your SLAs that you have with your service itself. It's usually acceptable for the service to fail if the dependency fails. Again, we can chart these out, your services, dependency services. And again, we see if your service is a tier 1 service, highly critical service, and the dependency is a lower critical service, that's a critical dependency, a dependency you need to pay attention to and resolve dependency issues that might exist in that interface. But if your service is less critical and you're depending on a much more critical service, you can pretty much ignore those dependencies. They're non-critical. Service tiers help you determine the criticalness and your level of focus that's necessary on each of your dependencies. The third use is in expectation management. We talked about critical dependencies, but that creates higher expectations, right? Higher expectations mean SLAs that might be more well-defined or higher performance, higher availability. Kind of described another way, the higher the service tier, the greater the expectations are on that service. The higher the service tier, the greater the expectations on that service. And greater expectations, I mean higher performance expectation, higher availability, higher responsiveness as far as when problems are resolved. The higher the service tiers, the greater the expectation. Service tiers help establish the appropriate expectations on the service. and as such are part of the contractual obligation of a service. So those are the three keys. Let's look at our t-shirt store again and kind of apply some of this. Let's look at a dependency. Let's look at the website and search engine dependency. So the website is a tier 1 service. The search engine is a tier 2 service. This is a critical dependency, which means the website needs to make sure that it continues to function even if the search service doesn't function, because the search service is lower criticalness than the website is. And that makes sense if you think about it. You don't want your entire website to go down simply because search doesn't work. So the website front end needs to handle failures of the search engine. Now let's look at this one, the view order service, and its dependency, the order management system. Order management, we said, was a tier 1 service. View order is a tier 2 service. This is a non-critical dependency. Basically what it says is, if the order management service has a problem, it doesn't make sense for the view order service to go out of its way to work around that problem. If the order management service is down, it's okay for the view order service to also be down. The view order service is less critical than the order management database. If we think about it, that makes sense, right? Viewing an order is important, but not critical. But the order management database is necessary for customers to check out, which is obviously a very critical component of our website. So that makes sense. The view order service can generally ignore problems with the order management service because it can expect that the order management service issues are going to be resolved in a timely manner, or timely enough. So I want to end with a quick story. This is actually a true story of a web application that had a problem that could have been fixed if they had used service tiers. By the way, the idea for service tiers isn't new. We used service tiers when I was at Amazon. It's a common way of dealing with services and building resiliency into services. But this company that I'm going to talk about had a web application and they didn't use service tiers. And what they had is a web application that did some things. I'm not going to describe who the company was or any of those details. It's not important. But this is a web application that when you logged onto the application, it puts your avatar in the upper right-hand corner. Now, lots of applications do that. Google does that, Twitter, Facebook. Lots of applications do that as a good indication of whether you're logged in or not and who you're logged in as. Absolutely fine. What happened on this site, though, and a problem that they had was, at one point in time, they had a problem where the avatar service went down. You guess what happened? The web application looked to try and find the avatar, couldn't find it, and it failed. The entire web application went down because it didn't understand that interface to the avatar service was a critical dependency that had to be made resilient. Now, you could argue and say, well, of course, I should have known that, right? Because that's an obvious thing that, obviously the avatar isn't important. And of course, what you should have done is just not shown the avatar and had everything else work appropriately. And in hindsight, that's easy to say. But beforehand, it wasn't quite that obvious. But service tiers would have allowed them to have noticed this mismanaged dependency and resolved it. And the reason why is because, for the most part, most of the web application itself was probably made up of tier 1 and tier 2 services, right? Things that were critical to the function of the application. But that avatar obviously was a tier 4 service. So that if they had done the service tiers and made the labels and had that as part of their culture in order to have this service tier mechanism as part of their culture and embedded into their culture, they would have noticed that they had tier 1 and tier 2 services calling a tier 4 service and gone, aha, that's a critical dependency. We need to resolve issues related to that. They didn't do that, and that was the problem. So service tiers really are more, they're not a big deal, they're just a label. But it's more of a cultural impact on your company, right? When you apply service tiers, you impact the culture of how your company thinks about how the services interact with each other. And that's the real goal here, the cultural impact of thinking about dependency management. And service tiers help make that a part of the culture and a part of your process of dealing with services. It's simple and basic, but it really is a critical component in dealing with the contract that occurs between services. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lee. That was great. And of course, in the world where we weren't constrained by money or people or time, then all the services would be highly available all the time, and we wouldn't have to worry about any of this stuff because nothing would ever go down. But what I thought was fascinating was this kind of gave us a roadmap of how to work out where we should pay attention, where we should put our resources, and a way of mapping that out. So that was really, really useful. We've just got a couple of minutes if anyone's got a question. If not, then there's some
I do want to, if you don't mind, throw in a quick plug. So I worked at Amazon for 7 years and now at New Relic for 7 years. And I learned a lot when I moved to New Relic, which was a startup at the time I moved to New Relic, about working for a company that deals with these issues very well and then working for a startup that doesn't have any idea what these issues are. And so as I dealt with those issues and helped them grow into the stable company they are now, I wrote a book on my learnings, and it's a book published by O'Reilly called Architecting for Scale. Service tiers are talked in that, but lots of other topics are in there. So if you're building scalable web applications, modern applications, and if you're a Safari subscriber, it's free. Feel free to go in and take a look.
Fantastic. I think we have a question back there.
Yeah, Lee, thanks. Great talk.
Sure.
So I'm a developer. Let's say I'm a developer and I own a tier 1 service,
Yep.
and I'm dependent on a tier 3 service.
Yes.
And I cannot necessarily guarantee uptime of that tier 3 service, but I need to stay up.
Yep.
I need to stay functioning. So I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, but don't you run the risk of then me as being the developer that owns the tier 1 service, then feeling like I have to build everything myself and I can't depend on others? So then I become a monolithic service? How do you avoid that paradigm happening and occurring? I mean, that's kind of then where certain things, that's when you run into like the kitchen sink service, right? And the kitchen sink service literally having everything in it.
That's a great. It's kind of an independent question from service tiers, but it's an important question. You know, you often hear this where somebody building a critical service says, I can't depend on this other thing. And often it's an external dependency outside of the company. Maybe it's a SaaS service or something like that. And it's like, I'm so critical, I can't depend on them operating. So I'll take the functionality I need from them and I'll embed it in my service. Right. That is a dangerous road in general to be on. Because like you say, it leads to monolithic services. Don't go down that path. Instead, the path you should go down is to figure out if you have a particular piece of functionality that is critical to you, that you cannot live without, that's in a tier 3 service. That's the reason why you should negotiate with that owner of that tier 3 service and say, because you're critical to this application, you really aren't a tier 3 service, maybe you should be a tier 2 service, and have that conversation. And that conversation gets the right messages to come through. Instead of duplicating capabilities, instead what you do is you get the conversation along the lines of what SLAs are appropriate for my service, do I meet the needs of my customers, what do I need to do in order to meet those needs, et cetera. And those are the right conversations to have.
And I thought that's where you were gonna go, but then you quickly run down the hill and all of a sudden everything is a tier 1 service. And then slicing and dicing between what a tier 1 or a tier 3 is can be incredibly difficult.
So the message to the tier 1 service that's saying this tier 3 service, you're critical to me. The question really on the back to the tier 1 service is it really that critical? And if it is, part of the negotiations to get them to raise their tier, but the pushback is, why am I critical and why can't you live without me? And perhaps you can degrade your experience when I'm not available, but still keep operational.
Right.
And so that's the other side of that conversation. Yeah, obviously, You can fall down the rat hole of making everything a tier 1 service. That doesn't help you at all. You can also run down the rat hole of saying, I will never call a service that's lower dependency to me and I'll build my functionality in. That's also a rat hole. But the right answer is for the service owner that's the higher tier service to think about what they need to do so that they can meet their SLAs and keep operational at the level they need to while making use of this service's capabilities when they're available and doing appropriate levels of back off and degradation as necessary.
It's failing
when not
gracefully,
available.
right? It's
Failing gracefully.
Okay, all right.
It forces the right conversations as long as you don't fall down those traps.
Thanks,
Right?
I'll take the
Okay, thank you. Thank you.